Hi, Dinah Monahan here. And first I want to tell you how honored and excited I am to be part of the virtual conference for Heartbeat's 50th anniversary. You know, I actually go back all the way to the beginning with Heartbeat, so I have a very special place in my heart for them. Today I want to talk about the culture of your center. And it's something that in the beginning you might not see as really important, but as you listen to me, I think it'll resonate with you. Why is the culture of your center important? When I started Living Hope Women's Center 30 years ago, I was a mama big love. I loved everyone and they loved me, and we would all love the girls that came in. I thought that's all it took, sort of like skipping through a flower field, tossing daisy petals of love. Because of my enthusiasm and God's grace, our ministry grew fast. It soon outstripped my nominal knowledge of administration and, well, running an effective, healthy center. It took a crisis to make me realize our center culture was toxic, and because of that, bad things were happening. I had hired a woman who constantly undermined me to my staff and volunteers. While I understood she was much of the problem, I had to ask myself, why did people listen? Why did they believe? Why did they question my commitment to the ministry despite the evidence? Even if they didn't believe the things, why did they allow them to be said without a challenge? That is what bothered me the most. I know from talking to other directors that I am not alone in experiencing personal attacks. After many tears, much prayer, and nearly quitting, I decided to take ownership of the problem and figure out how to prevent it in the future. I heard a sermon on Nehemiah that the Lord used to help me understand the problem and the solution. But first we need a little background on Nehemiah. The northern kingdom of Israel fell to Babylon in 700 BC. The southern kingdom of Judah fell in 605. Nehemiah and most of the other Jews were taken into captivity in 539 BC under Emperor Cyrus the Great. Nehemiah, along with 50,000 Jews, were allowed to return to Zion and their homeland. It was in this context that the Lord used the following passage to show me the problem and the solution in my center. So on October 8th, Ezra the priest brought the book of the law before the assembly, which included the men and the women and all children old enough to understand. He faced the square just inside the water gate from early morning until noon and read aloud to everyone who could understand. All the people listened closely to the book of the law. Now jumping to verse 8, they read from the book of the law of God and clearly explained the meaning of what was being read, helping people understand each passage. It was verse 8 that was the great aha for me. The people had been in captivity. Generations had been born and grown up without a national identity or an understanding of the law. If you would have asked them, they would have said, yes, we're Jews. If you would have put a basic statement of faith in front of them with fundamental tenets of Judaism, they would have been able to sign it. But that's where it ended. They had little knowledge, but no understanding. In this movement, we run on volunteer power as well as paid staff. Our staff and volunteers usually come from our churches. They sign a statement of faith, so we feel confident that we are all on the same page. But really, it isn't that simple. Years ago, I started noticing that our volunteers and staff would have opinions and actions that were incongruent with their stated belief system. I was really bothered by this. How is it that we are all Christians and pro-life, and yet volunteers and staff had such inconsistent views that translated into, well, some pretty unchristian behavior? That's then that the concept of purposefully establishing a culture came to the front. You see, every church, large corporation, small business, ministry, and basically any organized group of people has a culture. And the reality is, if an organization doesn't intentionally define and establish their culture, it'll default to the lowest common denominator. And I'm afraid that's human nature. And everyday conflicts and issues will erode the foundation of the organization without a well-defined culture to shore it up. That's what happened to me. The parallel can be drawn with women who serve in our centers. Many can sign a statement of faith, but they don't know anything about what the words mean. They have been raised in a culture that has abandoned moral absolutes. Postmodernism is simply the lens through which they see the world, and they bring that into their Christianity. Josh McDowell defined postmodernism worldview this way. Postmodernism is the philosophy that succeeded and to some degree supplanted modernism, a way of thinking that has challenged the Christian worldview for centuries. Whereas modernism rejected religion and superstition in favor of science and reason, postmodernism repudiates any appeal to reality or truth, and thus frowns on those who believe anything with conviction. You know, he said this many years ago, and I think it was prophetic. Look at it now. What's that have to do with the culture in our centers? Those people born and raised in this culture are like those Israelites who were raised in captivity. It is in the last 50 years that our culture has slipped toward complete godlessness and secularism. That's secularism. I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but acknowledging the outcome and understanding its origins and how it impacts culture are two different things. I followed Barna research for a long time. In 1960, 65% of Americans believed the Bible was true, and it was the source of moral absolutes. In 2015, they took a poll that is incredibly significant. The question was asked, is moral truth absolute or relative? Let's look at the results. In the elders group, which would be the really old people, I was actually surprised at how many believed it was relative. But it's also significant that 28% had never thought about it, whether truth is relative or not. Heck, you lived, got through the Depression, got through World War II, and went to church with your family. Moral absolutes were actually woven into the fabric of our culture. Boomers, 41% believe truth is relative. Gen Xers come in at 44% believe truth is relative. Millennials, 51%. And of no faith, 61%, which is not surprising. And other faiths, 43%. Then there's practicing Christians. Wow, 59% believe in moral absolutes as found in the Bible. That makes us feel good. We're different than the culture around us. Well, as they say, the devil is in the details. Barna then took a second poll of the same people. This poll found something very disturbing as to the current state of Christianity. It's titled The Morality of Self-Fulfillment. It breaks the information up between U.S. adults and practicing Christians. They asked the group if they agree or disagree with the following statements. Number one, the best way to find yourself is by looking within yourself. Percent of all U.S. adults, 91% agreed. Percent of practicing Christians, 76% agreed. People should not criticize someone else's life choices. Adults, 89% agreed. Practicing Christians, 76% agreed. To be fulfilled in life, you should pursue the things you desire most. U.S. adults, 86% agreed. Practicing Christians, 72% agreed. Next, the highest goal of life is to enjoy it as much as possible. U.S. adults, 84%. Practicing Christians, 67% agreed. People can believe whatever they want as long as those beliefs don't affect society. U.S. adults, 79% agreed. Practicing Christians, 61% agreed. And last, any kind of sexual expression between two consenting adults is acceptable. U.S. adults, 69%, and practicing Christians, 40%. Why is this so significant? Barna researcher David Kinnaman states, so there appears to be a dichotomy at work among practicing Christians in America. Most believe that the Bible is the source of moral norms that transcends a person's culture, and that those moral truths are absolute rather than relative to the circumstances. Yet, at the same time, solid majorities ascribe to 5 of the 6 tenets of the new moral code. Such widespread cognitive dissonance among both practicing Christians and Americans more generally is another indicator of the cultural flux Barna has identified through the past 2 decades. But it also represents an opportunity for leaders and mentors who are prepared to coach people, especially young people, toward deeper wisdom and greater discernment. To paraphrase this for our purposes, but it also represents an opportunity for leaders and mentors who are prepared to coach people, especially our staff and our volunteers in pregnancy care centers, toward deeper wisdom and greater discernment. This survey makes my point. What we have are millennials and Gen Xers serving in our centers who have the right words, but they have no foundation. They sign our statements of faith, but they have no idea how this translates into daily life and moral decision making. Like Nehemiah, we need to explain where the morals come from and what they mean for 2 reasons. First, we owe it to them. We who understand truth need to pass this understanding on. Second, because a center's culture will reflect this understanding or lack thereof. Let's look at some moral issues that comprise a Christian's moral worldview. Stealing, lying, fornication, adultery, cruelty, gossip, slander, and on the flip side, compassion, mercy, kindness, honesty, integrity, loyalty, self-restraint, selflessness, moral purity, and so many more. We assume that the definition of these words are universally agreed upon. These are virtues that are grounded in moral absolutes. But when you see them through the lens of what we have now, postmodernism, they can be fluid depending on the circumstances. As Christians, grounded in moral absolutes, sin is never right. It is never justified. The circumstances are met with compassion, but the sin is not met with approval. Israelites who had been in captivity for generations and did not know the meaning of the law are just like people in this generation. Gen X, Gen Y, and Gen Z. And I think the last 2 comprise millennials. They've been born into a world with a profound moral shift from moral absolutes. Yet it is the lens through which they see their world. Even though they are Christian, they have no concept of what it means to be a Christian. Years ago, we took in a troubled pregnant young woman. She had her baby and stayed in our lives for years. Her baby grew into a beautiful young lady who loved the Lord, went to YWAM training camp, and then came to stay with us afterwards. She ran our abstinence, I know it's not called that now, but hey, I'm old, our abstinence program, and was involved in the center. She then moved back east. She became pregnant and moved in with her boyfriend, intending on getting married. I talked to her about right and wrong in God's eyes, and she explained her position with justification from circumstances rather than God's word. I was really surprised. And the church she was attending, they were very supportive of the circumstances, and they didn't see anything wrong with them living together. Because she and I had a foundation, I'd been in her life for her lifetime, and it was anchored in love, I was able to speak truth without damaging the relationship. She eventually married this young man, and they went on to have other children, and they are doing well, and I'm still very much involved in their lives. Later, she told me that she now sees how wrong it was in God's eyes, and she grieves that she did that. Then she said this, "You are the only Christian who spoke truth to me. Why didn't more women speak up? Why didn't more women say the truth?" Because that's the culture that we live in. So how did we get here? It's important to understand this in order to understand how people from these generations think and process moral questions. And what does it mean for us and our sinners? This is why it is imperative that the culture be purposefully established and then exemplified by the leaders of the ministry. We should never assume that because it's a Christian ministry, it's a healthy, God-honoring ministry. All of this involves our interpretation of morals. Morals pertain to the relationship between people. In the workplace, family, church, friends, those less fortunate, the weak, the helpless, etc. To a Christian, a person's very value is rooted in the imago Dei, the image of God in us. To a Christian, a person's very value is rooted in the imago Dei, the image of God in us. But without the morals giver, they're just ideas that can morph and change with the culture. In this country, historically, our morals were defined by the biblical meaning. Take compassion and mercy, two highly valued morals. The meaning of these words are rooted in the biblical stories, like the Good Samaritan and the woman caught in adultery. In the past century, the shift in cultural makeup began in earnest. Up until that point, most of America at least claimed a Christian worldview. Moral absolutes was more of a given. It's not that there wasn't sin, of course there was. It's that sin was recognized and called wrong. To help you visualize this shift, let's look at these charts. This chart, number 1, shows the attitudes historically in our culture. Morals were defined by objective truth that is found in Scripture. They were anchored in the Bible, hence in God. The 1800s brought modernism. Science ruled supreme. And of course, Darwin's theory on evolution exploded onto the scene, and it laid the foundation for this shift. People no longer were seen as being created by God, as unique individuals with a purpose. They did not have an imago Dei. They were former apes who were former swamp dwellers, amoebas, and it was survival of the fittest. Evolution stripped people of their innate dignity and reduced them to a utilitarian existence. Chart number 2. This is what started happening. Our legal system was based on moral absolutes, or truth, anchored in the Bible. You know, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not covet, thou shalt not commit adultery, etc. But the culture's views moved away from this to subjective truth. Chart 3 is where we are now in our culture. Each person defines his own truth. Laws are redefined, and when you look at this chart, you can imagine a society at this state cannot survive, and this is the state we're at now. There will be chaos as truth is redefined by each group and individual. Now, let's look at chart 4. Since society cannot survive with everyone defining their truth, a strong man will rise up and will define morals apart from God and according to his interpretation. And historically, there have been terrible consequences meted out on individuals who did not accept the definition imposed on them. Look at Hitler and Pol Pot and Mao Zedong and Stalin. The transformation of our society started in earnest in the 50s. Madalyn Murray O'Hair won her lawsuit on behalf of her 9-year-old son that took prayer out of school. But not just schools. The problem wasn't the removal of rote prayer by squirmy, inattentive students. With that decision, God was removed from public life. Christian beliefs were marginalized and then criminalized in the public forum. In 2011, the class president at Hampton High School in Tennessee wanted to deliver a prayer at graduation. The principal issued an edict that any child who attempted to pray would be stopped, escorted from the building by police, and arrested. In Vancouver, Washington, 12 students were suspended for praying at school around the flagpole. There was also a boy who was suspended in a school for simply reading his Bible at recess. Crosses and creches are being stripped from our public landscape as towns face lawsuits from the ACLU. You cannot take the morals giver out of a culture and expect a moral culture. You know, Chuck Colson tells a great story about when he was at an event and was sitting next to a principal of a school. The principal was passionately talking about how God had no place in public schools. Later on, the conversation turned to the difficulty of running a school in this culture. The principal bemoaned the fact that kids would steal things with no remorse. Colson looked at him and said, "I think you should put a sign up that says, 'Thou shalt not steal.'" I had a similar conversation with my brother. I brought up abortion, and he said he had no right to say what was right or wrong for another. Later in the conversation, he angrily told me that his son's bike had been stolen off his porch. I said, "Well, Danny, you see stealing as wrong, but you don't have any right to impose your morals on others." To him, he sees stealing as right. To which he looked at me and said, "Touché." Do you see how impossible it is to defend this position? You know, Abraham Lincoln said, "The philosophy in a schoolroom in one generation will be the philosophy of the government in the next." 30 years ago, my son Brandon was in the gifted class in our rural elementary school. He came home and he told me that they had a project where they needed to come up with a solution to the world's overpopulation. My teacher had us close our eyes, he said, and imagine a globe with people just overrunning it everywhere. Well, you can imagine my interest was piqued. I went and I talked to her. I asked her what would happen if a child came back with a solution of killing everyone when they got really old, like 50. Would that be treated as a viable solution along with, say, moving people to the moon? She said, yes, I would put it on the board with the other ideas. I pressed her and she said it would probably be eliminated because it's impractical. And I asked her, if it wasn't eliminated, would you say anything about the solution being wrong? She said, I don't have the right to impose my morals on my students. If this happened in rural Arizona, it happened all over the country. The Lifeboat Game, where they asked second graders to determine which person they would choose to be thrown out of the overcrowded lifeboat to drown, was in every school system. The people were ranked by occupation, age, and accomplishments. Poor kids. What a terrible thing to put on a 7-year-old. This seemingly innocuous game was significant in the shift in our culture. So when Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger started spouting her ideas in the 30s and the 40s, they were radical and they were soundly rejected by society. The culture was still anchored in moral absolutes. But as this foundation shifted in our culture from absolutes to relativism, her ideas were free to take hold. On this shifting foundation of sand, the redefinition of the term merciful became acceptable. She wrote, "The most merciful thing a large family can do for one of its infants and members is to kill it." In the 70s, Dr. James Watson, winner of a Nobel Prize in Science for the discovery of DNA, and the first director of the Human Genome Project, this guy was really, really smart, redefined the word compassion. He stated, if a child were not declared alive until 3 days after birth, then the parents would be allowed the choice. Only few are given under the present system. I believe this view is the only rational and compassionate attitude to have. Moving forward, in October 1999, Peter Singer was appointed a tenured chair at the Center for Human Values at Princeton University. Now, Princeton University is a prominent leader in shaping national policy on bioethics. Singer argues that it should be legal for parents to decide to have their disabled infants killed up to, now it's been moved to 28 days after birth. This way, he says, parents could have non-disabled replacements. In addition, the infants would provide a source of organs for transplantation to other infants who could grow up to be non-disabled. Singer says that killing a non-person, even if it is a human, does not carry the same moral weight as killing a person. Romans 1:22 comes to mind. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools. Now we see this has taken over our culture. Even the words we use that used to have a commonly agreed upon definition are all turned upside down. Hate is used for anyone who believes in the Judeo-Christian view of marriage, sexuality, gender, life, and anything that disagrees with those who control this country. Tolerance has nothing to do with the reality of tolerance. Tolerance now translates as, you will believe what I believe or you are intolerant. The gender issue is a perfect example. If we don't agree that a transgender male is indeed a female and use the proper pronoun, we are intolerant and haters, and there are consequences. Love is now being redefined as any sexual attraction between two people. You've seen the saying, love is love. This has become the pedophiles' mantra as they push for acceptance. Words have power. When they are disengaged from the truth, these words will be distorted and twisted, and in the end, they will mean the opposite of God's definition and bring pain and suffering. The Bible says how terrible it will be for those who call evil good and good evil, who substitute darkness for light and light for darkness, who substitute bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. That's Isaiah 5:20. I think it's also so important that we can defend our worldview, but we can't defend it if we don't understand the worldview through the eyes of others. We have to understand how others think and the illogic of their position in order to defend our own. The next part of this presentation is more practical. We're going to talk about how you establish a God-honoring culture that offers safety, emotional safety, and just safety for your clients, but mostly for your staff and your volunteers. So especially if you're a leader, this is something you can do in your centers to bring about, to change the culture and to really anchor the culture in truth. You know, I have been a leader for so many years in a center, and as I said, we ran into problems. I know that it's a hard position to be in, and there are bumps and bruises along the way. But it's also a period where God teaches us about our shortfalls, our insecurities, and our issues. There is a way to minimize problems like non-productive criticism, mean-spirited words, and backbiting. And this is where the culture comes in. In 2007, after a destructive issue, we did a lot of work defining the culture of our center. We knew that if we did not define it, it would define itself based on human nature instead of God's truth. And it was very apparent that that's exactly what happened. We saw postmodern values woven throughout the decision-making and throughout the behavior of many of the younger client advocates in the ministry. So this was done in an effort to define our core values and make up our center culture, both what they are and what their root is in God's Word. This was done for three reasons. First, in an effort to define our core values that make up our center's culture, both what they are and what their roots are in God's Word. After this was established, we then defined how they determined our interactions in relationships and behavior in the ministry. And third, we demonstrated our core values through our actions, reactions, decisions, and relationships in and out of the center. Leadership especially is charged with modeling the culture and demonstrating it in their personal and professional lives. In other words, it has to start at the top. Culture cannot be created from the bottom up. It has to begin at the top and be modeled by the leadership. When we defend our culture, each person understands that they need to defend the culture when someone acts contrary to the defined core value, both for their sake and for the others. It protects everyone and keeps the standard in the forefront. When I originally did this presentation with my team, I prefaced it with the information that is earlier on this video, explaining what moral absolutes are, where they came from, and why they're so important. I wanted to make sure they understood why values must be anchored in truth and what truth looks like. Now comes the Nehemiah 8 part. There were probably 20 people in attendance. When I asked them what our culture was, nobody was able to answer. That was telling. They had worksheets, and with the worksheets, we set to work defining our culture. I drew on the bottom a foundation, just a rectangle foundation. And on that, I drew pillars, 6 pillars. And on top of that, I drew a roof. The foundation was truth, the pillars were our core values, and the roof was our ministry. So you can see the symbolism. Our ministry was set upon the core values that was anchored in the truth of God. Everyone had a voice in the process of coming up with core values, but not all the ideas were used. Now, I want you to know this takes time, and you need to understand what you're looking for, core values. You might break this up into many sessions. We did a all day long seminar in our center. As expected, honesty, integrity, compassion, and respect rose to the top. But remember, while we can all agree on the words, the meanings are very different for different people. And so we set out to define the words and the definition. This process was preceded with me giving the whole background so they understood why this was so important. You might think the things I go over are given in a center, but so many of my staff and volunteers were amazed at what I shared and realized they really had no firm foundation in moral absolutes. They really appreciated it, and it put us all on the same page of understanding. Now the practical application of this is establishing your culture. When you have this paper and you've drawn this, you look at the pillars and you say, okay, these pillars represent our core values. Now, you could have more than 6 or less than 6. It doesn't matter. On the bottom of the foundation, write truth. And on the roof, write the name of your ministry. And then in the vertical pillars, you write your core values as they came up. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the process here because it took a long time, but I will tell you a few of them that we came up with, and I'll tell you what it looks like. The first core value is honesty, and I'm sure that this will be the first one that comes up in every center's core value. We first went to the source that defines this virtue for a Christian, the Bible. It's sort of like Nehemiah reading the law, if you will. We then wrote the passages down. We wrote a passage in Proverbs 12:22 about God's concern about lying. The Lord detests lying lips, but he delights in people who are trustworthy. And then the harmful impact of lying is found in Proverbs 25:1. Telling lies about others is as harmful as hitting them with an axe, wounding them with a sword, or shooting them with a sharp arrow. Wow, that's strong. Peter 3:10 presents guidance. Whoever would love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil and their lips from deceitful speech. Ephesians 4:25 gives us motive. Therefore, having put away falsehood, let each one of you speak in truth with his neighbor, for we are members of one another. Matthew 15:18 through 20 makes it clear that honesty is a matter of the heart, not of our circumstances. But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this is what defiles a person. For out of the heart comes evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, and slander. These are what defile a person. Following the advice found in Zechariah 8:16 and 17 is the path to building trust. Speak the truth to each other and render true the sound judgment in your courts. Do not plot evil against each other and do not swear falsely. Once you have determined a core value and established its biblical definition, the next thing is to define what that looks like in the construct of your center. Here's what we came up with. Honesty means speaking the truth regardless of the consequences. It means recognizing that the truth is not dependent upon circumstances. It stands alone. Honesty is found inside the person's heart and not in the circumstances. In a practical manner, working on personal things when you are being paid at work is dishonest. You're paid by donors' money. They do not pay you to work on personal projects. And this is something that we had a precious lady named Alice Owen, and you talk about an example of the widow's mite. Every month she sent us a $5 check. And I used Alice as an example often. In fact, I just ran into someone who had been with me for years in the center, and she said, I remember when you used to talk about Alice Owen's widow's mite, and that's who we were to think of when we were spending our donors' money or working for the ministry. So obviously, unnecessary personal telephone calls while on the job is dishonest. Now here's another one. Copying copyrighted materials. It may seem innocent, but it's illegal. And people own the material and they work hard to write and produce it. It is dishonest to reproduce it. Here's another one you may not have thought of, but it came up pretty often in our center. Reporting people's statements inaccurately. You know, there were times when I would talk to someone and have to correct them, and then I heard them saying to someone else that I yelled at them. One time I took the person aside and I said, did I raise my voice? And they said, well, no. And I said, yet you said I yelled. Is that true? And she said, well, no, it just felt like it. Well, the reality is, what she said painted a picture in someone else's mind about me raising my voice and yelling at her. If we don't describe an occurrence accurately, then we are lying and are in the process harming that person. Another core value we came up with was moral integrity. You may not think you need this. However, stay in this ministry long enough and you will. We had a leader in our ministry who had been there for about 5 years send a montage of photos that were supposed to be funny, like they had little captions, and they were disgusting, actually soft porn. She sent it to another staff person because that woman had shared some inappropriate jokes with her. Our words have consequences. The first woman was upset when I fired her because she felt that I should have taken the time to work with her. I was like, you have worked here 5 years. If you haven't figured out that this was not appropriate after 5 years, after what we teach these girls, after how we value these girls, then I shouldn't have to teach you. There's something missing. She should have known this. So we had to define this as a core value with a detailed explanation. The core value was moral integrity. Now I'm going to skip the scriptural references for the sake of time, but here's how it worked out in our center culture. Moral integrity is respecting marriage. Marriage is a sacred covenant with God. If the person is married, separated, or going through a divorce, he or she is married, and there should be no emotional or physical involvement with others of the opposite sex. I can't tell you how often I hear, oh, well, he is separated and his wife is really mean, and then justifying being with that person and having relationships. All of our prayers, actions, and hopes should be for the reconciliation of the marriage, understanding that sometimes this is not possible. Avoiding the appearance of sin. People of the opposite sex who are married to others should not be together for any period of time, go on trips, or on projects outside of the normal center operations. Remaining sexually pure is part of a single Christian lifestyle. To the world, the word abstinence means not having intercourse, but all else is acceptable. To a Christian, it means that they remain sexually pure, avoiding temptation in situations where they can compromise their commitment to Christ. This is not because they have to, because it's a rule, but because they love Jesus. And working for a ministry like ours, it's especially important because of what we believe in, teach, and stand for in the community. We talked about language, that it should glorify God. We talked about our conversation, that it shouldn't be about personal things and things that are off color. We talked about jokes. Even we had to address accessing pornography or questionable sites on our computers, not just at the center, but at home. Here are some other core values we came up with. Unity, emotional safety. This is where gossip, backbiting, and slander come in. Mutual respect, Christ-like character. First, I have to reiterate that the leadership must model this culture. Volunteers and staff will emulate what they see. If you require them to act this way and you violate it, then it becomes useless. So how did this exercise shift the paradigm of our center? When everyone understands both the values and the definition, they're all at the same starting point. They're all on the same page. We had this all written down for anyone who came after this, and they watched the video, the parts that laid down and explained the moral absolutes, and then they read our core values and what we found in scriptural foundations and also the outworking in our center, and then they signed off and they said, I agree to uphold the core values of the center. The reason this is so important is because when you talk to them, when they do something against your core values, it's so much easier to say, remember the core value statement that you signed? Well, this is in violation of our core values. And I have to tell you, I have overheard when someone was gossiping to someone else in the office, and I overheard someone pipe up and say, you know, guys, this is against our core values. What it allows people to do is to use our culture, our core values, instead of saying, stop your gossiping, I don't want to hear it, you get to sort of blame the core values and address it that way. And it makes it so much easier. It truly, truly transformed our center. I can't even tell you how it eliminated so many problems, and everybody was actually anxious to uphold and defend our culture and the core values that held it up. Thanks for listening.